Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Tonic podcast, where I, Drew Nepoli, and my co-host here, Alex Capitco, discuss politics, whether it's in regards to the United States or the world. And today we're going to be discussing an idea in political theory, which is the Overton window. This was developed by Joseph Overton, who stated that this idea is basically discussing the range in which society talks about certain things and what is determined as popular and sensible versus radical and unthinkable, right? And we're going to be discussing one, not just the idea of the Overton window, but how it relates to, modern politics. We're going to be discussing a little about, India as an example of the moving Overton window, and we're going to be discussing its relation to current events such as the Capitol siege and Trump's politics and how that has shifted the Overton window in American politics. So, Alex, how you doing, buddy? Give us a little bit of background and your thoughts on the Overton window.
Hey, what's up, Drew? Doing pretty well, just staying at home, doing the thing. We're 10 years into the pandemic now, I think, something like that. But
It feels like it.
anyways, yeah, the Overton window is something that I think for decades people have really talked about, but over the last, I would say kind of in the Trump era, maybe even in the Tea Party era on, I feel like it's kind of become more mainstream again. And yeah, Joseph Overton, like you mentioned, I think he's kind of an interesting guy. He was definitely a libertarian, and his idea, and I'm just going to kind of just read the sentence out of his website that talks about it, was that if you want to have effective change in policy, he proposed it was not to advocate for minor changes, but to make this unthinkable idea become mainstream. And so, I mean, in a general nutshell, there's a spectrum that they always show, right? Where there's kind of extremes, maybe on the left or extremes on the right. And then in the middle, there's kind of a window that kind of goes in a gradient from like moderate to center. And that's kind of what are I guess you could say the Overton window is kind of framing acceptable dialogue, acceptable policy, and acceptable rhetoric during any period of time. And so the idea of someone like Overton is that instead of saying, hey, we want, I don't know, say we want abortion rights, instead of just saying, let's work on legalizing abortion in all the states, he would argue that let's just go to the extreme and say, let's just legalize all abortion no matter what. And it would actually cause that window to start moving in that direction. Even if it never gets to that extreme of legalizing all abortion, it would still maybe change the conversation. So over time, there's incremental steps. And I think the same you could say happens on, say, the right, but more in terms of dialogue. I feel like especially in the Trump era and kind of even going back to the Tea Party era, it's been kind of more about rhetoric and what can we say and what is acceptable to say, and can we keep kind of playing with that and expanding it and see how far we can go. So I'm just kind of curious because since Trump and since Brexit, and I think kind of since just the kind of crazy world we live in right now, it does seem like this window's expanding. And our kind of expectations of what people can say and what policies people are fighting for do seem to be expanding.
Which is really interesting because I agree. I agree that the Overton window, in my view, is expanding. The multitude of ideas and the breadth at which we talk about different ideas in American politics, at least, is expanding. I mean, to back up my claim, the fact that the popularization of Bernie Sanders, where a decade ago Medicare for all was probably considered outside of the Overton window, even progressives like Obama were not willing to go that far as of a full government rehash of the complete, insurance system, health insurance system, and a single payer healthcare. Like single payer healthcare was not in the Overton window, whereas in the last 4 to 8 years, Bernie Sanders has perhaps popularized an idea that has now entered into the Overton window. On the other side of the scale, things like separating immigrant families at the border from children is something that I don't think was on the Overton window, even for a anti-immigrant Republican in 2004. I don't think necessarily separating families from children at the border was something that would be considered on the Overton window until the Trump era, and so those are just examples of how I see the Overton window expanding in America. I think and the interesting thing is, again, the connection to the Trump era is I think a lot of people in the news hear the word normalization, and they say, oh, Trump is trying to normalize children's in cages at the border or whatever. And I think that plays into this idea of the Overton window. So someone who just follows the headlines might hear the term normalization. And then looking deeper into political science, you would discover that that plays into the idea of the Overton window, which is, like you said, the idea of the window is not just to see where we are, but actually how to move that window. And Joseph P. Overton and the political scientists that came after him discussed that this window is a means at which to actually understand where people are and then push them in a certain way. And what you mentioned was the Overton window is about you actually go for the unthinkable. You go for the unthinkable, and then people recoil back to something that's maybe more acceptable, but you've still moved the window across, right? I think a great example of that is the way that popular media, Democrats and Republican and middle of the ground Republicans are now viewing people like Mitt Romney, right, as a middle of the ground Republican who's rejected Trumpism, whereas in 2008 he was not at all a middle of the ground Republican based on people's perceptions. So that the Overton window has shifted. Trump has pulled the Overton window a certain way where politicians we considered pretty right wing are now viewed as more middle ground or just anti-Trump, so that their ideas in the Overton window are now less radical and more in the popular and sensible position.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That was something I was thinking about too, was kind of, I think actually kind of the split in the Republican Party is a perfect example of kind of the outcomes of the Overton window, I guess you could say, because I was watching a video and the point of the video was people don't have to accept an idea, they have to get used to it. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the idea of the Overton window. And I think about people like Mitt Romney, Bill Kristol, a lot of these never Trumpers, Kellyanne Conway's husband, people like them who I think in a normal era, progressives, centrist Democrats wouldn't like them, right? Like I think of Bill Kristol. He was one of the architects of the war in Iraq, a neocon, quite despised by the left. Yeah. But then Trump taints the party and just goes so crazy. And everyone expects Trump to lie. Everyone expects Trump to say crazy stuff. And it comes to the point that, okay, never Trumpers are like the normal now. And it's just really interesting to see that happening because it's almost skewed how we almost look at reality inside of our political sphere anymore. Because, okay, if you're not a Trump sycophant, all of a sudden now you're normal. And I mean, I could just go further into that and say that, we're used to everything Trump does. I mean, even in 2016, when he was talking about Hillary Clinton, he joked about not accepting if she won. And so I think going into this chaos over the last couple of weeks, a lot of us were kind of expecting Trump to do something because the bar is so low at this point. And that everyone's like, of course he's going to do something. We're used to it. And that goes back to, we didn't have to accept that Trump is going to challenge the election, but we're used to it. And you could say the same, I think, in terms of, Bernie's another great example. Like just the fact that he wanted to go different, obviously a different guy. And he's not rhetoric based as much as actually like moving the policy arrow, I would say. But it's true. If you're talking about stuff like free healthcare, free college, it does just change the compass of the room, changes the temperature of the room, And it's just interesting because I would say the Overton window is really about political boundaries. That's kind of what I would say. It's kind of just a map of what strategists can do. Now, where it's gotten more dangerous for me, I think is because I think the Overton window can be productive when either side is using it as a political strategy to put forth policy, right? Like when I used the abortion one earlier, or maybe gay marriage, when you're like, let's start with civil, or instead of starting with civil unions, you're like, let's just legalize all gay marriage. And then eventually there's some sort of compromise somewhere in the middle. But I'm more worried now because I actually think on a cultural level, the left is trying to shrink the Overton window in terms of how we talk about things like race, gender, systematic racism, the police. But then on the other side, the right is just trying to take advantage of this window and see how much can become acceptable. And I think that's part of why the nation is so split culturally, is because, like, I was talking to a friend last night about this, and sorry, I'm going off on kind of more culture for a second, but take like an issue like transgender, right? Like this is something that there's so much nuance to it that it's really hard to just put it under one umbrella, just to say that, all transgender issues are the same. But I would say over time that you're called a transphobe. Say if you said that I don't believe teen girls should be allowed to make this decision on their own until they're 18. because I think that when it comes to identity politics, defund the police, some of these type of more cultural movements, I would argue that the window's actually shrinking on what is acceptable to say.
Again, I don't think this is necessarily.
It,
I'm
it
not.
could be.
I'm
I mean,
not
it could
sure it
be a
is
stretch.
because like I get what you're saying, and I think this is less to do with like PC culture and more again like the policy proposals that are being thrown out. Because
Well, defund the police, right? I mean, I could
right, but
say
that's what I said. But
if
defund the
you
police is an argument that I would say increases the Overton window because the idea of completely defunding the police, and I'm not saying I agree with it, but I'm saying on the public stage that conversation has not been had before, and I think that whether or not you agree with it, that idea expands the window because of the tumultuous times we live in and events like George Floyd's death have sparked new discussions about race, new discussions about justice and policing. I'm not arguing you have to agree with them, but what I'm saying is I actually think it expanded the Overton window of what are the different options for how we police our society. Now, on the other hand, the Overton window has expanded because some people believe that it's okay to have a militaristic police force on the right wing, and that expands the Overton window as well. Um, you know,
That's a fair point. That's a fair point. I'll concede that one.
because I would argue, because again, like one is I consistently argue that the pervasiveness of PC culture is not as strong as people think it is. Like most people, I would argue 9.9 out of 10 are not their careers are not threatened by, you know what I mean, like PC culture. So
Absolutely.
I really, it exists, but I don't think it's as pervasive as people think it is. And I would argue that the radicalization of these both sides of American politics is expanding the Overton window.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and you do. Yeah, I when I kind of look at more from that side, I think you're right in a lot of ways. I I think I was more talking about discussion more than policy, like kind of what the rhetoric is going around, and what I more mean is that I think that say initial like systematic racism, because it's such a blanket statement. I would say that now, if you don't agree with, say, certain aspects of how we even define that, the ability to actually explain how you feel in terms of policy, it might be more limited. But again, that might not be the Overton window. I feel like you're right. I think I might have miscategorized that. I think that's more just kind of the polarization of our country.
Yeah,
But I think you're right.
because if you were like criticizing critical race theory in a room full of progressives, it would feel like you're outside the Overton window.
Right,
But I
right,
would argue,
and that's what I mean.
but I would argue outside of that room of progressives, in a room full of various Americans from all different backgrounds and sides, I don't think you're outside of the Overton window. Do you know what I mean?
That's a very good point. I totally agree with that. Totally agree with that. Yeah, and so what do you think then about people like, say, like an Alex Jones on the right? Do you think that people like them have played with the expansion of kind of the rhetoric on the right in terms of the Overton window? Because I mean, Pizzagate, for example, to me, Charlottesville, Pizzagate, and now the storming of the Capitol last week have all kind of built on each other, right? Because to me, last week almost seemed like Pizzagate on steroids, right? People were believing a lie, and they actually took up arms to fight that lie. And it's almost like something like Pizzagate seemed nuts 10 years ago or whatever it was. And now that people were expecting people to storm the Capitol in some ways, like, do you think that could kind of fit into the changing of action in terms of the Overton window? I don't know.
Oh, 100%. I mean, the fact that the fact that we've gone from, Pizzagate being this weird conspiracy that was almost a blip on the map where we thought it was, to now you have QAnon being so prevalent that there's multiple representatives in our government that are like quoted as being a QAnon congresswoman, a QAnon state representative, and they wear that badge proudly. The fact that that insane conspiracy theory is now is within our Overton window is now, like, I mean, not for me, but for the American public discussion. The fact that you have a serious group of people that believe in QAnon is great evidence to the idea that our Overton window is off the charts. Um, I really don't think conspiracies like that would exist 50 years ago. Now, the Overton window is not shifting just for no reason. There's reasons. I think one is, you know, we've talked about it, is how social media has played into polarization and radicalization. People now can find their own groups of people that agree with everything they think and enter that echo chamber, that vortex of an echo chamber, completely free of any challenge to their opinions, and they don't need to be challenged by the public, because you can basically just be anonymous online, think whatever you think, and even if someone gets mad at you, you can just block them. So that I think that allows for the Overton window to expand, because remember, the Overton window is based on public perception, the overall public perception. And if the overall public perception is less accountable because of our anonymity online, then that window is going to expand, and that's what we're seeing. And I think, again, the main point of that is social media has played a huge part in the expansion of this Overton window.
Yes, it has, and now it's almost gotten to a point where I don't even know if we can fix it, And I actually read an interesting article it's called "The Flaws of the Overton Window," and they actually brought up a really interesting point, which I just want to read, because I think that from everyone from Rachel Maddow to Overton himself to Tea Party members, I mean, so many people have kind of taken this theory and really kind of ran with it in terms of understanding how policy changes and is adaptable,
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to read this quick 2 sentences, because I think it's kind of interesting, and I'll butcher it probably if I don't read it. So it says, is it changing the acceptability of certain rhetoric of the population, or is it just echoing the views of the radicals on each side? This is perhaps the Overton window's biggest drawback as a theory of change. It tells us more about the handful of activists who supposedly move the window than the voters whose opinions actually change. While Trump has certainly lowered the standard of debate on the right, he didn't have to move the consensus rightward. He played to a block of supporters who already found his proposals desirable. Sanders, too, connected with bottom-up movements such as the Fight for $15 and Occupy Wall Street. I just think that's kind of interesting, because actually, no, there's one more part. It also says that the Overton window, the reason why it's so popular now is because it almost describes a time that doesn't exist.
Huh.
It's not really an indication of where we're headed anymore, because and so like in general, this whole article is about how it used to be more of a strategy from both parties to get little pieces of a more radical idea, right? But it's almost now like we're so tribal that does it really matter anymore?
Um.
I mean, I don't know. That's believe me, I don't know.
Yeah. Is this still a useful tool to view public opinion? Is kind of the question, I guess, right? Like, is this?
Exactly.
Do you think so? I mean, shit.
I don't, because I almost feel like we've got to such a tribal part of our democracy, is that almost the Overton window requires discussion, because if you're always throwing out radical ideas, if you ever want to actually get something out of them, something tangible that you can actually implement as policy, you're going to need agreement and compromise. And I feel like at this point, both sides are kind of throwing out radical ideas that only the base that likes those ideas supports. Um, so right now, I don't really know if the Overton window even works anymore, because I mean, on the right, especially on the Trump side, like some of his policies are so extreme that even like centrist Republicans don't agree with them. And I would say the same on the left, with a lot of more critical race theory, defund the police, stuff like that. Like, yes, it has caused a conversation, but we still haven't seen a lot of tangible policy yet. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, there's a conversation, but there's not much out. It's just kind of like consolidated bases. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, it's tough to
I mean,
say
that's a whole tough one.
because I mean, I don't know. I think like the I think the Overton window is expanding, but it's still useful, because I think, like, if you look at, like, let's say like Trump and your middle conservative, right? I read a poll that says like 70 to 80% of Republicans still believe the election was like unfair, which is just amazing to me. And the fact that, like, you know that's still so high is because of Trump pushing this Overton window. Now,
Mhm.
maybe the argument is the way that the window is so wide now that it's still now it's just basically encompasses everything and it's useless. That might be the case, but that may not necessarily be a bad thing. Noam Chomsky in 1998, I wonder if he'd make the same argument now. And Noam Chomsky in 1998 made the argument that the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion. Um, but allow every lively debate within that spectrum, even encourage the more critical and dissident views. That gives people the sense that there's free thinking going on, while all the time the presuppositions of the system are being reinforced by the limits that put on the range of the debate. Now, I think, given that Noam Chomsky said that in 1998, at a time where Al Gore and George Bush coming up in the election in 2000 were almost indiscernible, right? I imagine Noam Chomsky who's a, pretty anti-neoliberalism, pretty outspokenly against global capitalism. I imagine he saw it as, America won't even discuss things like social medicine, and he was probably pissed off that America was in with such a small bubble of neoconservatism and neoliberalism. But he probably Noam Chomsky is probably also upset that the Overton window expansion has now included proto-fascism. If you look at things like the Capitol siege, a a demagogue like leader promoting his supporters up until the very end, where he basically had to then say no violence, but up until they were at the gates, promoting them to basically go against the democratic process. That to me is proto-fascism. And so that's something that now is within our Overton window, apparently. Maybe not, because there's a huge backlash against it, but almost we got there. So there's good sides and downsides to this window expanding. It's not necessarily a bad thing that the Overton window is expanding. It allows for us to look at new and different ideas, and maybe adopt things that perhaps it wasn't in the American conscious 60 years ago. On the other side, though, is the Overton window has expanded to the point where we get Donald Trump, and so I think it could be a good thing or a bad thing. I just think it was interesting to bring up Noam Chomsky's criticism of keeping the Overton window small, and now that it's expanded, it's gotten crazy.
Yes, yes. No, I think that's a really interesting point. Is like, I think a really interesting thing you said a few minutes ago was that it almost seems like maybe the window's been opened to so much that just all the shit's flying in now.
Yeah.
That's sort of the feeling I get a little bit. And before, I think we're gonna have to keep this episode semi-short today, but I did, with the last couple minutes we have, I did want to reiterate that this is not just something that's really going off the rails inside of the United States. I think one of the bigger shockers is in a lot of Eastern Europe, but mainly in India with their current leader Modi, because he is a Hindu nationalist, and his rhetoric towards Muslims has gotten borderline scary in a lot of parts. And he's always been a Hindu nationalist, but about 10 years ago, people would laugh you off if you were expecting this form of kind of militant Hindu nationalism to be in the mainstream in Hindu politics. And we could do a whole episode on all the specifics, but he basically has made this Hindu nationalism mainstream. It's called Hindutva, and it's kind of a concept of Indian cultural, national, and religious identity. And he's really made it mainstream. Like, it's been okay to now kind of treat the Muslim community as second-class citizens. And in parts, he appointed Yogi Adityanath as the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh. And this is quite an anti-Muslim person. So he's an extremist. And so all my point is that Modi's constant attacks on the Islamic community over time, I think, have expanded that Overton window as well. And it's kind of scary to see, because I bet if you looked at the predecessor to Nazi Germany and Hitler's rise, I bet some similar things could be happening.
Yeah, people forget that, Hitler's rise in Germany did not happen overnight. It did actually happen over 20 years of normalization, the Overton window changing. And that's a really good point, that India's seeing it. The Hindutva, the idea of a Hindu-Indian nationalism and identity, you're right, has increased with Modi, going against I think it's called the Nehruvian secularism that the Constitution was founded on. So yeah, this Overton window is expanding or shifting, and it's interesting to note that Overton himself didn't really want it to be used on the left-right scale, and kind of wanted it to be on the more freedom, less freedom scale, but it's still, I think, useful to apply to the American political system, especially since the Overton window, I think, in America has been relatively small and only recently expanding quite rapidly. So definitely an interesting way to frame political science and kind of theorize about the changes we're seeing in American politics, as well as the world politics, as we mentioned. Hopefully you guys glean some kind of information from this episode. And if you're watching live, stay tuned. In a few minutes, we're going to have a guest come on. And if you're listening to the recording, definitely check out the episode with our guest as well. Take care, all, and thank you for listening.
Awesome. Take care.